Thank you very much. We're all here now. I think you probably know all of us. There's the Chancellor, first of all. There's VЄra Jourová, the European Commissioner for Justice and much more. There's Manfred VЄra, European Parliament. Moshe Kantor again, and David Harris, the Executive Director of the American Jewish Committee. Now, as on previous panels, the form is for everyone to have 2 minutes, 2 brief minutes to speak, because it's a very tight day, partly now because people have got to catch planes in the early afternoon. But perhaps, Chancellor, could I ask you to, I think you should take the prerogative as Chancellor to speak first and give us, can I ask you what specifically you are expecting Austria to lead and to do in specific sort of legislation or changes of behavior against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
Also ich habe zunächst schon einiges dazu sagen können, was wir vorhaben auf europäischer Ebene, aber ich glaube, es ist auch in Österreich nach wie vor genug zu tun.
But I think there is a lot left to be done in Austria. You said we only have 2 minutes, so I can only mention 3 points, areas where we are active and where we believe that our initiatives can be successful. First, strict legislation. Other countries can learn from us. For us, it's a matter of course because of our own history. We have very strict laws regarding anti-Semitism and the dissemination of anti-Semitist ideas, and very strict sanctions are imposed against people who violate these laws. So we have a strong awareness of what is wrong about that. The second point is security for the Jewish community. We have a small but vibrant and active Jewish community in Austria, which needs to be protected. The security situation in Austria is better than in other countries, but you can never do enough. And my third point concerns education. Minister Fassmann is here amongst us today, and I think awareness building will be possible in schools by confronting pupils with this issue, but also in the context of migration, we try to convey values to refugees who come to our country. And this also involves anti-Semitism, because many of these people come from countries that do not share our history and do not, therefore, have the same awareness. If there are better ideas, we are grateful anytime.
What is Austria and what is the whole of Europe to do about the huge existential change, perhaps, that there are now 20 or 25 million Muslims living in Europe, and this is going to change societies in fundamental ways? How do we deal with that in a proper manner?
Well, I think the most important thing is not to look the other way. Whenever we talk about anti-Semitism, there are many people in the room in the European Union who try to say that we have also other problems of hate and hate crimes. So there is from some people always the wish not to talk about anti-Semitism in particular. So I think the most important point is not to look the other way. Be honest and brave enough to focus on this special problem. Second point I would say is, of course, to fight against illegal migration, because you should only let as many people immigrate in a country as many you are able to integrate. So I think that a not registered and not organized flow of immigrants can always be a problem for a country, and especially a strong flow of immigrants coming from Muslim countries can cause troubles like a different understanding about Israel or anti-Semitic ideas which we would not like to have in our societies.
Thank you. Well, I'd love to hear more from you, but I think it's not fair to you or to other members of the panel that I continue to ask you questions, but perhaps I could come back to you. David Harris, I know that you are particularly pressed for a plane back to home for Thanksgiving, so would you like to give us your 2 minutes now?
Good morning and thank you. I'd like to make 2 points at the outset. One a very personal point, but one I think that may inspire a bit of hope. I brought with me from New York an honorary doctorate that my father received here in Vienna 40 years after he had conducted research on the synthesis of the heavy hydrogen atom as a teenager from 1936 to 1938. At that time, as a result of Anschluss and Kristallnacht, my father was expelled from the Chemical Institute and spent the next 7 years in a horrendous journey for which there is no time to describe today. 40 years later, in 1978, I very reluctantly came to Vienna, despite my father's warnings, in order to work with Jews fleeing from the Soviet Union, responding to the words, "Atpustin narod moi," let my people go. And I began to discover a new Austria, but one that had still not come to terms with its own past. And today, in 2018, we come to what the Chancellor has said is the first ever European conference on both anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So if we're looking for a source of inspiration and hope, I think that this arc represents as much that source of hope as anything I can think of. My second point, in the year 2000, my family and I moved to Switzerland for a year-long sabbatical. It was in that year that we began to see the reemergence of anti-Semitism on European soil. And I could spend the next several hours recounting to you the literally thousands of meetings that we at the American Jewish Committee have had with European leaders since 2000, trying to wake up a largely sleeping continent. Because we understood from the beginning that to confront anti-Semitism requires more than just words, more than just actions from the Jewish communities themselves. We must enlist the power of governments and the resources of governments, from education to law enforcement to the judiciary to intelligence gathering. And without governments, we will stand largely alone. And we made the other point, that anti-Semitism and yes, anti-Zionism is not a Jewish issue. It's an issue that may target Jews, but in this case, it's a European issue that fundamentally threatens the European guarantee to protect human dignity. This time, should anti-Semitism take hold, Jews have a place to go, unlike my mother and father's time when they were in Austria or occupied France. But where will Europe go if it fails to meet the challenge? I could tell you about meetings with Jacques Chirac as President of France, Hubert Védrine as Foreign Minister of France as long ago as 17 years. I can tell you about meetings with the Prime Minister of Sweden recently. All of them refusing to recognize that anti-Semitism is present. It's a clear danger. It must be confronted. There's a specificity to it. And Jews cannot and must not act alone. This is Europe's challenge to deal with. We are here to support and stand with Europe, but we cannot replace the resources of Europe unless they're determined to protect human dignity, in this case, the future of the Jewish people.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me first thank Mr. Kurz and Austrian Presidency for putting the issue of anti-Semitism so high on the agenda of the Presidency. This is a very crucial, very important step. And I am here on behalf of the European Commission, and I can tell you, David, and all of you, that the EU recognizes rising anti-Semitism as a serious problem where we all have obligation to do our part of the job, to stop it before it's late. This is what we heard from Benjamin Netanyahu before we started. What are the obligations? I will start with the society. Society must not stand passive. I had a very impressive debate with Rabbi Lau last year, and he described to me how the people reacted on Crystal Night. Passivity, a kind of silent endorsement, silent agreement, which caused the turbulence and continuing of the violence. This is something which must not happen. That's why education is so important. That's why the civil society, which is still able to raise the voice against anti-Semitism, must do so. But what are the obligations of the politicians? It's a shared obligation for the EU and for the member states. I will start with the EU. We are convinced that we need to understand what's happening, what are the sources of anti-Semitism, what are the trends, where are the epicenters, simply to have the proper data and to be able to take proper political decisions. That's why I tasked Fundamental Rights Agency to do a very thorough survey in 12 member states to show where we are. And I already have some figures today, but I have only 2 minutes, so in case you are interested, I can share with you some of them. We will publish the full report on the 10th of December at the International Day of Fundamental Rights. How to work with the data? This is the necessary thing to do the necessary steps at all levels. At the EU level, we are very intensively working with IT sector with the big IT platforms. Just one taste from the survey: in all the member states, the Jewish community report to us that they find internet as the source of danger, and that there must be something against this. So in the EU, since spring 2016, we have an agreement. It's a kind of gentleman agreement, the code of conduct with big IT companies. So now we have covered 95% of the market in the EU, and they have the obligation to delete within 24 hours hate speech, which is also targeted against Jews. I have something like map of hatred in each country. There is the list of, sorry to say it, but usual suspects, the groups of people and individuals who are targets, and Jews are having more and more prominent, I'm unhappy to say it, position. So they have the obligation to delete it, and they have the obligation to cooperate with the police, with the law enforcement authorities. Now we are working hard on adopting the directive on combating terrorism. The IT sector will have the obligation to delete the messages of terrorists, including adoration of terrorist attacks and so on, within 1 hour. And they will be under sanction. So this is a very, very big step forward how we deal with IT sector and the threats which go towards the Jewish communities through internet. There must be the proper action from law enforcement. This is the member states' obligation. And at this moment, we see that the Jewish communities have to invest their own money into strengthening their security. This is not fair. There must be more done at the member state level. I know I should finish, so just three things. Yesterday, the EU joined the VЄra. We became the EU permanent international partner. So I think this is a very strong step forward. We work with the VЄra definition in all the education activities. We are investing, we keep the funding, and we will continue to do so. One personal comment, sorry. Working in the field of fundamental rights requires courage. I would never believe that it will require courage to raise voice against anti-Semitism, and thank you, Mr. Kurz, for doing that. This is courageous, and this is important. And so, me working in the field of fundamental rights, of course, I am a very frequent target of different fake news. Most of the fake news make me pretty upset. There is one fake news which makes me proud, and this is that I am a Jew. Thank you.
Ich möchte mich zunächst bedanken für die
First of all,
Gelegenheit, dass auch das
I'd like
Europäische
to
Parlament an der Diskussion
thank you for
der
giving the
Ratspräsidentschaft
European
teilnehmen. Diese Kollegen
Parliament
hier, Makaras,
an
Heinz Becker,
opportunity to
darf ich vielleicht kurz erwähnen, für das
participate in
Europäische
this
Parlament eine
conference.
fraktionsübergreifende
For the
Arbeitsgruppe
European
leitet, die Kampf
Parliament,
gegen
Ottmar Karas
Antisemitismus,
chairs a working group across
Präsent ist und
party
dort die
lines,
Fahne der
which
Parlamentarier
works on
Lassen Sie mich vielleicht mit zwei
the fight
grundsätzlichen
against
Erwägungen beginnen. Das erste
anti-Semitism. Let me start with two fundamental points.
Simone Weil, die erste Präsidentin
Simone
des
Weil,
Europäischen
the first
Parlaments,
president of the
eine
European
Auschwitz-Überlebende,
Parliament, an
hat,
Auschwitz survivor,
40. Jahrestag der Befreiung von
on the
Auschwitz-Birkenau
40th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, delivered an impressive speech, and she said that remembering the Holocaust was a momentum for Europe. Never again, it was a starting point for the reunification of the continent. Never again any war on this continent. Never again racism and anti-Semitism.
Und deswegen ist mir wichtig zu erinnern,
And
dass wenn
therefore,
wir heute über
I think
Antisemitismus
it's
reden, dass
important to
wir
recall when we're talking about anti-Semitism today, we have to relate that to the development of the European Union, because that was one of the initial drives for this development. And I myself, like Sebastian Kurz, belong to a generation that has learned at school, in history classes, about these things, but these are things that have come to life for me through my encounters with survivors in Bavarian schools. And what I experienced there, when we had a discussion at school, was that this became tangible for me, a commitment not only to remembering but also to assuming responsibility. A couple of weeks ago, I was nominated by my party as the successor to Jean-Claude Juncker as Commission President, and I decided that my first trip abroad would take me to Auschwitz, and this is what happened yesterday. I also visited our Polish friends in Warsaw in order to document that our generation has an even bigger task to assume than the post-war generation, because at that time there were still many survivors. And a third point which I'd like to make here, when we talk about Jewry in Europe, I think it would be wrong if we only talked about remembering the Holocaust, because today the culture of this continent, without the contribution made by Jews, without the culture which we appreciate so much, this would be impossible, and therefore the positive approach to the appreciation of Jewry on this continent is just as important. It should be the real motivation for us to be committed to a lively and modern Jewry in Europe. And if you allow me a more concrete statement, I would really wish that finally we can agree on the uniform definition of anti-Semitism in Europe, because only then will we be able to monitor developments. The figures we have are worrying, they are alarming, but what we need is a common definition. And Europe should
Entwicklung in
have
Bildung
more
zu investieren.
funds
Ich durfte gestern
to invest in education,
genau auch ein
in
Bildungszentrum für junge
development.
Menschen besuchen,
Yesterday
die
at
dort tätig
Auschwitz,
sind und
I visited
eben in die
an
Zukunft
educational
diskutieren. Und diese
center for young
Forschungseinrichtungen, diese
people who discuss
Bildungseinrichtungen
what
sind nicht
should
nur
happen in
nationale
the
Aufgabe,
future.
sondern sie haben
Such
europäische Aufgaben. Sie müsste
educational
Europa gemeinsam
institutions
dort unterstützen
not only have
und entsprechend
national
vorangehen. Und
tasks to
der
fulfill,
wichtigste
but
Punkt,
also
der wurde bereits
European
mehrfach jetzt
tasks.
in der
And the most
Diskussion
important
angesprochen,
point
der
was
wichtigste
already
Punkt ist die
mentioned
Frage der neuen
repeatedly. It's the
Kommunikationsformen,
question
mit
of
denen wir
new
herausgefordert
forms
sind,
of
wie wir Hass, wie wir
communication, which are
Antisemitismus bekämpfen
challenging,
können,
which challenge us to find
Medien. Und da
ways
möchte
and
ich
means
ausdrücklich die Arbeit
of
der
combating
Kommissarin
hatred
hervorheben, dass da
and
viel passiert ist. Aber ich möchte
anti-Semitism in the
dokumentieren,
social
dass
media.
es
And I'd
politisch
like
den
to
klaren
commend
Willen,
the
und ich glaube, ich
Commissioner
kann sprechen
for the work
im Namen der
that has
Kollegen,
been done.
dass es politisch
But
den klaren
at
Willen
political
gibt,
level, and
sollten
I
die
think I'm
sozialen
speaking
Medien
on
ihrer
behalf of
Verantwortung
my
nicht
colleagues,
nachkommen.
that
Wir haben
there
da
is a
nach wie vor
clear
auch
will to
Sorgen,
make
auch
sure
Defizite.
that if the
Ist
social
der
media
Gesetzgeber in der
do
Lage,
not
klare
live up
Regeln
to
zu
their
setzen?
responsibility,
Nicht
the
nur bei der
legislator
Frage
has to define clear
Terrorwerbung zu
rules,
verhindern,
not only when it
sondern auch bei der
comes
Klarstellung,
to
dass wir
preventing advertising
Fake News und
for
Nachrichten im Bereich des
terrorist
Antisemitismus
activities,
zu unterbinden
but
haben.
also
Und da
when it
möchte ich
comes
gerade,
to
weil auch
eliminating
Verlagshäuser
fake
da sind, weil
news
Verleger da sind,
about
deutlich machen, was heute in der realen
anti-Semitism.
Welt, in der
Publishing
gedruckten Welt
houses
nicht erlaubt ist, darf auch in
are
sozialen
not allowed
Medien
to
nicht
print
erlaubt
certain
sein. Und das
things,
sind
and this should not be allowed in the social media either.
soziale Medien
The social
nicht nur
media
IT-Unternehmen, die
are more
heute
than
die Technik
IT
anbieten, sondern
companies
sie tragen
that
heute mit ihrer
offer
Macht, die
and
sie haben, auch
provide
mit
the
dem
technology.
Einfluss, den
They
sie
have an
haben, eine
enormous
enorme
power
gesellschaftliche
and
Verantwortung.
influence,
Deswegen
and
sollte sich
therefore
niemand täuschen,
they have to
wenn es nicht gelingt,
assume
es in den nächsten Monaten,
responsibility
Jahren
for
umzusetzen,
what is
dann wird der
happening
Gesetzgeber
there.
in
And
Europa
I
dafür
think
sorgen, dass die Prinzipien, die wir in Europa für richtig
nothing
erkennen,
is
auch in der
going
digitalen
to be
Welt mit aller
changed
Härte
in the years
durchgesetzt
to
werden.
come. The legislator will see to it that strict rules and regulations are applied in the digital sphere as well.
Finally, Mr. Kantor, very much enjoyed your presentation just now. Can I ask you two more questions? Do you think that the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in Europe is inevitable? And how do you propose to counter it? And secondly, can the Jewish street overcome anti-Semitism on its own?
Partially, I already answered these questions in my opening remarks. Yes. But, you know, it's a big question to everybody of us, why it's so important to fight anti-Semitism. Maybe society can live with anti-Semitism as society is living thousands and thousands of years. But we have to understand one thing. We are living today in the very speedily changing normality. Normality which is changing because our last catastrophe is getting far and far from us in time, and new ethical values came to our life. And we are living not for fighting anti-Semitism, not for protecting Jews. We are living for all of us, for our quality of life, to have our life longer, and this could be described in very particular performance indexes. How to be protected against war, against terrorism, how be more protected for accelerating technological revolutions, how to have prosperous and dignified society, and etc., especially how to make really promoting of young generation included through education, and etc., etc. These performance indexes, the number of these performance indexes are not so many. But the interesting moment is that all these performance indexes of the quality of our future life dependent on two important parameters. This is the balance between tolerance and security. It's a funny thing, but it's reality. And if we do not pay enough attention to the fight against anti-Semitism, we are not prepared for new normality, not only for Jews, for everybody. This is the most important message which I want to deliver on behalf of European Jewish Congress. Please fight against anti-Semitism, not for Jews, for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very eloquent and absolutely correct. You have to make that distinction and that joint need. David has to leave, I know, and I know I'd like you to say something else before you do.
I apologize for leaving before the end of the session. It's nothing that's been said. Rather, it's the fact that Thanksgiving is tomorrow, and I promised my granddaughter I'd be there for her. I want to state at the outset that I'm a Europhile. I believe that the vision of Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, and the others who conceived the European project in the path of the Second World War were extraordinary visionaries who created the most ambitious and successful peace project in modern history. My wife and my children are all EU citizens. As a lifelong believer in the transatlantic partnership, I also believe we have a profound stake in Europe's future because we must face the world together as a community of values. And as this discussion has revealed yet again, those values on both sides of the ocean are being challenged. Let me be very specific in, again, what I think are the main issues. Several years ago, I had the privilege of speaking at Mauthausen. I was preceded at Mauthausen by the then President of Austria, the President of Poland, the President of Hungary, and the Chairman of the Russian Duma. All four spoke very movingly and eloquently about the past, about the victims. Not a single one of the four mentioned the present. Not one. Not one mentioned the threat to living Jews as opposed to dead Jews. Not one understood, or if they did, mentioned the centrality of Israel to the Jewish people. Not one. Allow me to be very blunt. I'm not interested in people who commemorate dead Jews if they don't have a commitment to living Jews. I'm not interested in more monuments, more memorials, more walls. I'm interested in more synagogues, in more Jewish centers, and in more Jewish schools. In other words, I'm interested in the Jewish future. I'm not interested in writing more tragedy from the Jewish past. So leaders, if they're going to lead, have to confront issues which for many have been deeply uncomfortable for them. Because in a way, it's an admission of some of the failings of our societies. But again, over the last 18 years, we have traveled to every European country again and again and again as friends, as Europhiles, as transatlanticists. And then the answer became almost robotically education. Well, no one is going to object to education, especially in the presence of the Minister of Education. But deconstruct the word, what does it mean? Well, France tried to teach in its schools the Shoah, in those schools in the banlieue. And what happened? Read a book by Barbara Lefebvre called The Lost Territories of the Republic. How many of the migrant children pushed back at the teachers and said there was no Shoah. The Shoah was an invention of the Zionists to justify the illegal creation of the State of Israel. You want to know what a Shoah is? Look at the Palestinian Nakba. And many of the teachers were clueless about how to deal with this. So it's easy, again, to hold up the word education as the response. No one can object. We all know we have to reach children, but how do we reach children? How do we reach children in the 21st century? And are the 28 EU member states sharing best practices with each other? or is each going it alone? We spoke then about prisons and the radicalization in prisons of people who went in for crimes and came out ready to be jihadists. We asked who were the imams going into the prisons, and most of us looked at us with a blank face. What are you talking about? We talked about social media, and yes, we understand as Americans that many of you in Europe don't fully understand our First Amendment sacredness. But we too have an obligation in the United States to work with social media companies which often are in a way violating European laws by promoting incitement to hatred. And lastly, we said, and I presented this at a European Commission meeting, and I want to particularly single out VЄra Jourová for her remarkable work over the last 4.5 years in this regard. She's been extraordinary. And Katarina von Schnurbein, who spoke with you earlier, we spoke about a values contract with migrants. My family has a PhD in integration. My mother was a refugee from Stalin and then from Hitler. My father was a refugee from Hitler. My wife was a refugee from Islamic fundamentalism in Libya. Each of them, without social workers, without elaborate conferences, having been expelled, started anew, found their footing, and understood that the gift they had been given of a new life was the only gift they should be asked for. And one word on Israel. I'd offer many, but time is short. I'd like to see European governments angrier about the treatment of Israel in the international community. Instead of going along, too often, European governments need to stand up more and show backbone, exactly as Sebastian Kurz is now doing, and demonstrating that it can be done. Why among 193 UN member states is only one's legitimacy consistently called into question? Why among 193 UN member states is only one nation's right to defend itself met with responses like cycles of violence, mutual restraint, instead of what should be, as Matthias Döpfner said very clearly, Israel's absolute right to defend itself as any nation would? Why does the United Nations Secretariat have 3 permanent committees to defend the Palestinians against Israel? Why is there a separate agenda item at the UN Human Rights Council for Israel and only Israel? Why is Israel the recipient of more condemnatory resolutions in the UN system than North Korea, Syria, Iran, Venezuela, and others combined? Where is the anger? There's a place for diplomacy. There's a place for moderation. There's also a place for anger. It's time to show some anger. Thank you.